In this tutorial, you will learn how to make your scene look just like this in Blender. The main techniques used are cel shading and then color posterization as a compositor effect. It's easier than it sounds, so let's get into it. First, let's do these gummy bears. I used a trick where they all share the same material, but with randomized colors. Create an object info node, plug the random value into a color ramp, and then set all the colors you want it to randomly choose from. If you want all the colors, set the black and white to pure red, then create two new colors and set their positions and hue to 0.333 and 0.666 respectively. Okay, now to the actual cel shading. Add a shader to RGB node, then a separate color node. Set it to HSV. Then a combined color node, also set to HSV. Plug all the values in, and plug that into your material output. Now add a color ramp and plug it into the value, and set it to constant. This is where you will determine the values for the cel shading. Screw around with it until it looks good. The values here will depend on the lighting in your scene and the brightness of the object's color. I like to brighten up the leftmost color. This limits how dark your object can get. And that's all there is to it. Now let's give the wall a material. Copy and paste the same setup, but this time set the color to a texture. For my use, I'll set the interpolation to closest. I also like to add a bump map. For this, I'll use the same texture but set to linear interpolation. You can mess around with the principled values and the color ramp to get something that looks good. Here I make the last color darker. This gives it sort of a ring effect, which makes it look more gritty. That sums up the materials. Now let's head to the compositor for the final touches, the posterization. We use the same technique here, run the image through a separate color node set to HSV. The difference here is now we add a math node set to snap. In Blender, all colors are represented by values between 0 and 1. And the snap node will take that value and round it to the nearest increment. So the lower the increment is, the more colors your scene will have. I like to use a different value for the hue, saturation, and value. In my project, I use 0.04, 0.2, and 0.02. Now I like to bump up the saturation a little bit because you can see here it's being rounded down. We can have even more control over the colors using color ramp nodes. This is completely optional, but I like to run the saturation through a ramp. Add 3 values just like this, then squeeze the 2 of them together. This will make the saturation more extreme, pushing gray colors even grayer and saturated colors even more saturated. This adds to the gritty look. Another thing I like to do is add a color ramp to the color value, and set the black to be a little lighter. This limits how dark the darkest color in the scene can be, no more pitch black. There's one more trick I'd like to use. With all these shading effects, it can make the walls and floor sort of blend into each other. We can use ambient occlusion to exaggerate the edges and corners of our scene. Just go to the View layer in the Properties menu and tick the ambient occlusion box. Then go to the Compositor and add a Mix Color node. Set it to Color Burn and plug in the image in the AO. You can mess around with the factor in the occlusion distance. Here I'm using 0.08 and a distance of 1.5. Anyways, that's all for the tutorial. Leave a like if you learned something, and thanks for watching.